You're not going to own up to that.
He's got enough garbage on me. So I sent Doug a text that said, Doug, if you're looking for something to do today, my yard got blasted.
There you are.
Here, pull that out. There you go. And I'll plug you back in.
Yeah. Oh, we got our hairs out like this.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
I was complaining to the guy about once that microphone went out last night, I couldn't hear it.
Yeah.
So he says, okay.
Hooked him up with the amplifier.
That was really good last night.
Yeah, I only heard half the
I
conversation.
didn't expect it.
I thought it was going to be...
I always thought I'll skip this.
Yeah, and it turned out to be really good.
They were really good.
I mean, they played off, and particularly when they lost the lighting,
Yeah.
and they played off each other. And I'm actually glad they're using graphics now. Remember, quite a few years ago,
I tried to get him to
they didn't use any graphics.
I tried to get him to fix that mic.
I know.
Just shoot.
Number one, they did move this panel, and they had all the performances
Yeah.
together.
Well, that was a hoot.
That was good.
That was very good.
Yeah.
That was the first one I came to.
They could really counter off each other.
Yeah.
But you're right. I don't know why they didn't use graphics before.
Yeah.
I mean, any class you could, they use
Well,
graphics.
they well, the college professor all just come in.
There you go. And then they have drone.
Yeah.
Would you?
We went to a thing a couple years ago in Montpelier, and the son of the was taking the very first guy who got up there to speak. He went on and on. I retained, I understood and retained
Nothing. Yes, and then I want to get my pencil out and take notes so I'll keep awake.
Yeah.
No.
Well, we found a beautiful
It's the monotony of the voice.
house in an equestrian community for Winston, and it's not big. And the master suite's on the first floor. It has a 3-car garage. It was, but everything, and we could have taken it just as is, even with the furnishings, and we didn't.
Where was it?
Near, you know where Keswick is, right? But they're right outside of Charlottesville.
Okay.
In that kind of that little triangle area there. And it wasn't a big yard. I mean, we just both walked in and went, this is it.
I would love to do it. I don't know.
Well, maybe they do it more than once.
So they do it all the time.
They do the same thing there. That they do.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
It's a book signing and something at Montpelier.
Yeah, we enjoy that. If that becomes a school night for me, I gotta work.
You start early. What time do you end?
It depends. It could be.
Good morning, everybody.
11, 12 o'clock at night. I mean,
Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Everybody having a good time so far? Good, excellent. It's been a fantastic conference so far. The subject matter has been wonderful. You know, Steve McLeod, who we thanked yesterday, should get a lot of the credit for the topic and the programming, including that fantastic skit from last evening, which is all his brainchild. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Doug Bradburn. I'm the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library. And this is a library program, even though it's down here. And I would love to take credit for the topic this year, as it is really the first year I've been involved in the George Washington Symposium. But it really is all Stephen. I would say to Stephen, well, we should do something on, like federalism or the Constitution or something on politics, and he just kept saying, George Washington and the Arts will be a really good program. So I have to give credit where credit is due. Now next year, there's been some questions already, so I wanted to announce that the program for next year will be the 240th anniversary of George Washington becoming the Commander-in-Chief. In 1775, and so the program is going to be designed around George Washington goes to war in an interdisciplinary way. So we're going to look at some of the politics of the moment, some of the military history, but also some of the material culture of warfare. And so you really will get a broad array of different types of scholars, and it will be fantastic as well. And we will have the replica marquee that George Washington had. It will be here at Mount Vernon at the time, so there'll be lots of fun events associated with that as well. All right, so in addition to that, I'm supposed to talk about some of the other library programming. I know that some of you have done, and you should take a look at the website to see what's coming. We have our evening book talks lined up all the way through next March. The next one is going to be Denver Brunsman talking about his great book on impressment in the long 18th century. We also have a number of luncheon fellowships coming up. For those of you who are members of Mount Vernon, you get a first chance to see our fellows who've been at the library for 3 months giving a talk about what they've found and what they've been working on. And that's a lunchtime event. There'll be 2 of those towards the end of this month, and I think in early December as well. So we hope to see you there. All right. But now, without further ado, let's get back to the main event. And you have a real treat this morning because you have a real star who's going to give this opening presentation. You've got to put the really dynamic speakers in the morning. We know that, and that's what we've got for you today. So I'm setting this up nicely for you. So who do we have? We have Maury McGinnis. Maury McGinnis, who is incredibly talented across multiple threat levels here. She is the Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and Professor of Art History at the University of Virginia. Received her BA with highest distinction from UVA. Now, as someone who was an undergraduate at UVA and received his BA with no distinction at all, I didn't even know something existed like high distinction. So that's very impressive when I saw that. But more impressive, she went on and got her MA and PhD from Yale University, which, of course, as you know, has got the great program in American Studies and art history, architectural history. So it's really fantastic. Served as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Academic Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences, has been professor at UVA, James Madison, but importantly published extensively on American art history, including a number of books and edited volumes, one of which, Slaves Waiting for Sale, Abolitionist Art in the American Slave Trade, won the prestigious Charles C. Eldridge Prize at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, as well as a literary award from the Library of Virginia. She's published Shaping the Body Politic, Art and the Political Formation of the Early Nation, In Pursuit of Refinement, Charlestonians Abroad, and curated a number of exhibits all over the place. And this morning she's going to give us a great story about Cincinnatus or Marcus Aurelius. So everybody give her a big Mount Vernon welcome.
Good morning, and I have to say I'm incredibly impressed to have such a full room on a Saturday morning, and they even started early and all the seats are filled. So thank you all for being here, and I look forward to being able to share with you a story of 2 of the great sculptures to George Washington. I enjoyed last night tremendously. I learned a couple of really important things that I didn't know before. One, as a fan of a sports team that has a tendency to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And if you're a UVA fan or a Washington Redskins fan, or we can go down a long list, you've probably been saying that for years. I had no idea George Washington coined that, as we learned last night. And last night was so much fun because many of us who are art historians try to imagine that event all the time, right? What were those conversations that went on? That said, we try to imagine them. If we actually knew them, we wouldn't really have jobs. So it's probably just as well that many mysteries remain. And certainly for me, I'm going to be talking about conversations that we actually don't have that much access to. And so our story today is going to be centered a couple hours south of here on I-95 in Richmond, Virginia. Because there are two monuments to George Washington. The marble sculpture by Udon that was commissioned in the 1780s, and the bronze monument by Thomas Crawford, which was commissioned in the 1850s. Both are intimately associated with Thomas Jefferson's Capitol building. The Udon stands inside the building's rotunda, and Crawford's monument rises to a height of 60 feet just outside, and it's that little circle in the upper left-hand corner of Capitol Square. Both sculptural projects were obviously intended to memorialize George Washington, but they do so by drawing upon entirely different classical precedents and thus serve to immortalize distinct images. During the years immediately following the American Revolution, Washington, as Cincinnatus, the citizen general farmer who happily stepped away from power, was a particularly appealing symbolism. But by the middle of the 19th century, Washington, as Marcus Aurelius, the great imperial general, seemed more appropriate to Virginia's leading political leaders. Washington has been used by many different generations and in many different places to carry whatever meaning that time and those people wanted him to have. And so this morning, my paper will explore the ways in which these two different monuments of Washington in Richmond captured the changing meaning of George Washington and the Revolution for. Now, the Udon sculpture is one of the best-known works of American art. Yet the details surrounding its commission and its execution deserve a re-examination. The choice of representing Washington as Cincinnatus has long been accepted as obvious. And yet it turns out that such a choice is really quite surprising once of the 1780s. As it is typically written about, Washington preferred to be represented in his uniform, but the symbolism of the piece is nevertheless neoclassical. And that seemed to many generations to be the rather obvious answer to all this. And so the scholarship tends to talk about his hand resting on the bundled fasces, the rods that are a common Roman symbol, and here they're updated by being 13 in number and have arrows in between. His sheathed sword, very importantly, that he's put his sword away, hanging from there, and the plow, all of which are then usually associated with the Roman general Cincinnatus, and then scholars assume also with the Society of the Cincinnati. While that has been the accepted historical and interpretive narrative for decades, the contextualized story is considerably more interesting. First of all, that the sculpture exists should be a surprise. America actually had very little precedent for monumental sculpture, except for a few marble statues in a few major cities, including the one in Virginia of Governor Berkeley, Baron Botetourt, that then sat in the central alcove of the second Williamsburg Capitol. It was commissioned by the Virginia House of Burgesses, damaged in and around the Revolutionary War, so we see an image of it shortly thereafter, and later moved to the grounds of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. There was also a statue of George III in New York, as well as a couple sculptures of William Pitt. And that's really it in the American colonies. But as soon as the war ended, the Congress authorized to have an equestrian monument dedicated to Washington. And they described what that monument should look like. Quote, "The general is to be represented in Roman dress, holding a truncheon in his right hand, and his head encircled with a laurel wreath." Now, such a decision was directly in line with European precedent and the way in which monarchs were typically represented. And it shows us how that even from the start, political leaders imagined that the representation of the nation's new heroes would be based on these both European and classical precedents. Though the project was approved in 1783, it was not funded, a story we hear quite often about the arts and the US, and thus it fell to Virginia to be the first to set Washington's image in stone. So in 1784, the Commonwealth of Virginia voted to erect, quote, "a statue of our late worthy Commander-in-Chief, General Washington." And to do this, they turned to Thomas Jefferson, who was then residing in Paris, for assistance in determining which sculpture should be given that honor. Jefferson unreservedly replied that there could be no question, but that it should be Monsieur Houdon, unrivaled in Europe. So the state assumed that the only way this could be accomplished would be by sending a portrait of Washington to Paris. And they thus asked Charles Willson Peale, whom we all learned last night by this point had already painted numerous portraits of Washington, to create a full-length picture. And it was then packed and shipped in the first ship bound for France, sent to the care of Thomas Jefferson. Now, the details of this portrait had actually been specified by the Virginia governor, Benjamin Harrison, who specifically requested that the background include a perspective view of York and Gloucester and the surrender of the British Army, which he wrote, "I believe may be useful to the statuary if any pieces of history are to be made in bas-relief on the pedestal of the statue." Peale told the governor that he had added the French and American officers with their colors displayed, and between them the British with their colors cased, and that these figures would serve to tell the story at first sight. So the Peale portrait was intended to give Houdon accurate details of dress and costume and military devices. Nevertheless, they left the details of the commission to Jefferson himself. As the governor wrote to Jefferson, the Virginia Assembly have only provided, that is specified, one side of the pedestal, and that the others, with the dress, etc., are left to the exercise of you, essentially. A lot more words, because in the 19th century, they like a lot of words. This would be a very pleasing employment for us, he continues, if we have ever turned our thoughts that way, or were adept in the science of devices, emblems, and etc. But as we are not, we have unanimously fixed upon you and my friend Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who we all know are fully competent at the task. You are therefore left entirely at large and have the whole discretion of this business committed to you. Very important. So clearly the state imagined that this work would be more than just a portrait, that it would have an emblematic purpose, that there would be devices and emblems that was meant to tell a story. And such a question is particularly important because there really is no precedent for how to create a sculpture of the leader of a new republic. How should he be represented? Should they follow European precedent and do a monumental equestrian? Well, that was out because it cost too much. Or should they follow what they would refer to as pedestrian sculptures, that is standing sculptures? And here we're looking at a sculpture of George III, where the precedent was to dress people entirely in classical garb. So those are the precedents, and the question is how to do this. So our story really centers around these three people: Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington. These are our players in our story. Jefferson and Franklin, both resident in Paris, go to Houdon and are able to convince him not only to take on the project, but to travel to the United States. And he traveled back with Benjamin Franklin, who left Paris at this point, so that he could directly work with Washington. Now, part of the impetus for this long voyage, I mean, this is not hopping on a plane and you're here in 7 hours. This is a multi-week journey when Houdon's not able to be making any progress on any of his work. But he did so because what he wanted was that big equestrian sculpture commission from Congress. So Jefferson arranged for Houdon to meet with many in Congress while he was here, for as Jefferson explained to them, the most important object with him is to be employed to make the General Washington's equestrian statue for Congress. Nothing but the expectation of this could have engaged him to undertake the voyage, as the pedestrian statue for Virginia will not make it worth the business he loses by absenting himself. So Houdon comes in 1785, visits with the Congress, and spends 17 days at Mount Vernon. And these have been well covered and documented by other historians. And this was one of those moments when we wish we could have known those conversations. Now, that said, I don't think they were particularly rich because Washington didn't speak French and Udon didn't speak English, and any correspondence between them was done through, not well, through people who could translate a bit. And by the end of the visit, Udon had taken a life mask of Washington, modeled a clay bust, and taken careful measurements for the full figure. And all of that comes back with him to Paris. But what is particularly important for the interest of this paper is that even after his visit, it is clear that they had not decided really what the form of the statue was going to be like. In fact, Udon later made 2 different models of a pedestrian statue of Washington, one fully antique and one fully contemporary. A German tourist commented on these 2 different versions when he visited Udon's studio, and in this Boilly painting of the sculptor's studio, you can see those 2 versions. You can't see them in the crowd. I realize that because they're a big blur once you put it on a PowerPoint. But when you can see the painting in person and really examine it closely, you get appropriate to a man of rural pursuits, a light pleated vest, half buttoned, sandals on his feet, a cloak fastened across the chest and enveloping the back and shoulders, suggesting the protection of an agriculturalist against bad weather. One hand rests upon a walking stick, the other on the Republican fasces. Crowned by a liberty cap, at his feet stands a plow. So that's how one of them was described. That's the kind of classical version. The other one, he's in fully contemporary clothing. So we have these 2 very different models. The contemporary one had no devices. It had no symbolism. It was just Washington. Our final combination is a combination of the 2. How did it get there? How did we end up with this really rather radical fusion of the 2? Now, we've come to accept this as a rather obvious solution, but it would not have been in the 1780s. Traditional French academic sculptural practice would have recognized either the antique mode or the modern mode, but the combination was unprecedented for a living person. The closest parallel is the monument to Major James Wolfe, designed by Joseph Wilton and unveiled in Westminster Abbey in 1773. Undoubtedly, Udon was familiar with this work and its combination of antique and modern elements. In it, Wolfe, who died in the attack on Quebec in the pivotal battle of the 7 Years' War, is shown nude, somewhat covered by an antique drape, expiring on a Roman couch, and attended by a wealth of allegorical classical symbolism. But he is surrounded by faithful soldiers in modern attire. The end result is one that seems to combine an instantaneous repertorial mode and a timeless homage. But still, this is a monument to a man who had died, and so that separation of nudity and modernity can also be seen to separate the realms of the living and the dead. And so representing Washington's really not quite the same thing. The answer of how best to represent America's leader resides in part on the transatlantic correspondence between Washington and Jefferson, and that little early role that Franklin played. So Jefferson wrote to Washington telling him that Franklin had left before they had decided upon the form of the statue. What he wrote as the costume of the statue was decided upon. And he said to Washington, "I can't so well satisfy myself, and I am persuaded that I should not so well satisfy the world if I did not consult your own wishes on the inclination as to the article of clothing you're wearing." So he asks how Jefferson wanted the statue to be finished. "Permit me, therefore," he inquired, "whether there is any particular dress or any particular attitude which you would rather wish to be adopted." So how far advanced were Udon's full-length models when Jefferson wrote this letter to Washington at the beginning of 1786? I actually think, from what I've studied about Udon's work, that he hadn't even begun, right? He had done a first bust of Washington that's exhibited at the 1787 Salon. This is a marble bust a l'antique, right? So in antique dress. These are very common and really kind of the prevailing precedent in Europe at the time. And so a classical version would not at all be surprising because, as I say, these are the dominant mode. Many have argued that it would not have been at all surprising for the culture of educated men in the 18th century to see Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, the 5th century BCE Roman statesman who led Rome through a period of crisis and then yielded power to return to the life of a private citizen and farmer, as an obvious precedent for Washington. It was well known through numerous sources that were popular in the period, and we hear those relationships being made not only in America but France and England as well. So the connection of Washington with Cincinnatus was made immediately upon his resigning his commission. And we heard last night about Charles Willson Peel's grand triumphal arch that he created for Washington to ride through. And we heard last night about the lowering of the laurel wreath, and I don't know, was the head really bobbing back and forth as he tried to keep the wreath on the head? I don't know if that's fact or a great fiction, but it's important that that laurel wreath was intended, and the Pennsylvania Packet wrote about it as they're describing his ride through the triumphal arch. Cincinnatus, crowned with a laurel, returning to his plow. The plow adored with a wreath of the same. The countenance of Cincinnatus is a striking resemblance of General Washington. So they're making that connection to me. Washington is the Cincinnatus of America, who hung up his arms in the Temple of Peace and laid on the altar of Concord the sword with which his country. So this is a really regular relationship that's made between these two. It's important to know that in the 1780s, they're comparing him to many other classical leaders as well. But it is Cincinnatus who really kind of hung on and became the dominant relationship. So when Washington finally gets around to answering Jefferson's question, basically, how do you want to be dressed in your sculpture, he suggests that modern costume would suit the situation better. Here's what he wrote. Lots of dissembling here. In answer to your obliging inquiries respecting the dress and attitude, etc., which I would wish to have given to the statue in question, I have only to observe that I, not having sufficient knowledge in the art of sculpture to oppose my judgment on the taste of connoisseurs, I do not desire to dictate in the matter. Nobody does. So on the contrary, I shall be perfectly satisfied with whatever you may be judged decent and proper, but I should scarcely venture to suggest that perhaps a servile adherence to the garb of antiquity might not be altogether so expedient as some little deviation in favor of the modern costume, right? So a paragraph, which I'm sorry to bore you with, but I think it's great because it gives you such great 18th century flavor that actually, no, I don't want to be in a toga, is what he's saying. And I think what he's really saying is, I really don't want to be nude, right? And he mentions specifically that there is precedent. So he says he learns that Mr. West, Benjamin West, an American painter who was then resident in London and one of London's leading painter, had done just this. So what is he talking about when he's mentioning Mr. West? Well, he's talking about The Death of General Wolfe, a painting that was made in the early 1770s, but gets enormous play throughout both Europe and America, and is very well known. It's about the 7 Years' War, but it is indeed widely known and continues in circulation. And this is what Washington was referring to as West has set a precedent for modern heroes being represented in modern garb. So it's important to note that nearly every image of Washington then in circulation, and there were dozens of these prints, almost all showed him in modern costume, but specifically in military costume. And it's really not until the presidential years that Gilbert Stuart shows him in his well-known civilian clothing. So when this discussion is taking place in the mid-1780s, people tend to associate an image of Washington as one in military dress. So Washington's preference for the modern costume is surely in hand as Houdon begins working on his two models. It seems likely, therefore, that the unique solution, part modern, part ancient, resides in the interactions and the conversations of Jefferson and Houdon. It was Jefferson who selected Udon, Jefferson who conveyed Washington's wishes to the sculptor, and Jefferson himself who went to Udon and to discuss the details of the commission. In fact, Jefferson spent a lot of time with Udon. In the State Archives of Virginia and the Library of Virginia, there's a long list of the many different payments that were sent by Virginia to Jefferson to take to Udon. Jefferson has his own portrait made by Udon. He buys 7 patinated busts from Udon. He is there regularly in conversation with Udon about this commission and the others. We don't know those conversations, right? We'd really like to be able to imagine them. Jefferson himself makes the choice to have himself shown not à l'antique, but instead in modern garb with his hair, not a wig, tied back. Jefferson's own choice leans in this direction, and both he and Washington are central to the conversation going on in the new United States about how the defined not by markers of royalty, nobility, and status, but instead as simple citizens. And it seems like this conversation must have gone on between Udon and Jefferson. So what details might they have discussed? Jefferson was attentive to crafting this kind of public image. And so the real question here is, what should a monumental portrait look like, right? Not a simple portrait bust, but a full-length. Jefferson agreed that it should be approachable. He wrote to Washington approving of his choice for modern dress. I was happy to find, he writes, that the modern dress for your statue would meet your approbation. I find it strongly in the sentiment of West, Copley, Turnbull, and Brown in London, after which it would be ridiculous to add that it was my own. You know Jefferson doesn't think it's ridiculous to add his opinion to this. I think a modern and antique dress as just an object of ridicule as a Hercules or a Marius with a periwig and a chapeau. So in other words, it would be silly to put an ancient in a modern wig, just as it's silly to put a modern in ancient clothing. So perhaps it is in a conversation between the two of them that they come up with this unique combination of the two. The letter quoted above is particularly suggestive because Jefferson not only agreed with Washington, but presumably made that preference clear to Udon. Even more intriguing, however, is that on the question of the proper sculptural representation of one of the most famous men in the world at this moment, he relied upon 4 painters, 4 American painters at that. Despite the fact that Udon was working in a French academic system, he was being encouraged to pursue an innovation popularized in painting at the British Royal Academy, and then not part of French academic practice. Even more importantly, the examples put forth are painters that actually don't provide a precedent for this combination. The paintings are in the modern mode, and contemporary events and persons are represented in modern attire. Consider classical allusions certainly appear in numerous portraits, such as Mather Brown's portrait of Jefferson, where the young diplomat is dressed in contemporary attire, while behind him stands the allegorical classical figure of liberty. It's not tended to be nearly as overt, though. It doesn't tend to be nearly as overt as what will emerge out of the Washington sculpture. So the next question is, why Cincinnatus? And following that, is there a connection between that choice and the Society of Cincinnati? Most scholars make a leap very quickly. Here's Washington as Cincinnatus, and it must have something to do with the Society of Cincinnati. So the question is, does it? So who are the Society of the Cincinnati? In 1783, a group organized by General Knox to advocate for the rights of those who had fought for the Continental Army had already selected the name of the Society of Cincinnati for their organization. They drafted a symbol or a sort of seal, as well as an emblem, which is an eagle. This is fame crowning Cincinnatus with a wreath. And as the plans for the society continue to develop, it's important to note there's enormous opposition to this, particularly from Jefferson. Now, the controversy is that many saw the Society of the Cincinnati as, at least as that it would produce a hereditary aristocracy. There was a concern that being a member of the Society of the Cincinnati or being the son of a member of the Society of Cincinnati would immediately catapult you in the social stratum. And Jefferson is writing directly to Washington to complain about the Society of the Cincinnati. Washington is writing back and saying, well, we don't want to abolish the society because our French friends really like this. The most important of whom is the Marquis de Lafayette, who was elected president of the Society for life. And the King of France approved the wearing of the eagle at court for all the French members, and it became a sought-after mark of distinction in Paris. So there's this tension here around the continuation of the Society of the Cincinnati, particularly for men like Jefferson. Lafayette is the most visible symbol of the friendship between the two nations, and Jefferson, too, is a great friend of the Marquis de Lafayette. And he is working with Houdon to commission, also for Virginia, a bust of the Marquis de Lafayette to go in the rotunda of the Capitol to stand next to Washington's sculpture, and so more points of conversation, and the Marquis is shown wearing his eagle. Importantly, Washington is not. So many people have tried to say that the thing poking out from his waistcoat is the eagle of the Society of Cincinnati. No, it's not. It's a seal, and you would wear it up here. He is not sculpturally represented with the Society of the Cincinnati. And we know that Houdon knows it because he's already made the bust of the Marquis de Lafayette to go to Richmond to have it. So that's very important, that he is not being represented as a member of the Society of Cincinnati, and I suspect Jefferson has a lot to do with that. So the decisions are being made during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Jefferson knows Houdon's options of the two, and somehow or another we end up with this combined version, where we have Washington entirely in modern garb, but not as a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, surrounded then entirely by classical symbolism that belongs to Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, the man who was giving up power, not remaining as the sort of leader of Rome. Very important in the moments of the Constitutional Convention, when there are certainly some who are ready to crown Washington as king and give him titles of His Majesty and so forth, that the selection of how you represent Washington is a man stepping away from power. It is a statement of republicanism. Now, tellingly, the sculpture doesn't show up in Richmond until 1796. It seems to have been finished by 1792. But it's not received until 1796, and there seems to be no fanfare. Really, nothing goes on in Richmond to welcome this sculpture. This seems to relate to the tension over the Jay Treaty at the moment and the very partisan feelings that have taken over politics at that moment. All of that, of course, evaporates in 1799, and whatever tensions there had been go away, and Washington, as this great Republican leader, becomes a very valued and cherished symbol in Virginia. But by the 1850s, it's not enough. Richmond in the 1850s wants a monumental sculpture of George Washington, and they initiate a competition, and these are some of the designs that are submitted for that competition. Those designs clearly are responding to something we're going to learn more about later today, the already completed monument to Washington in Baltimore, designed by Robert Mills, and the already designed but not built Washington National Monument, also designed by Robert Mills. Now, the story of the Washington National Monument tells us a lot about the politics of the period. Inside the Washington Monument are memorial stones from states and societies. Here's an example of some of the ones from the South. Ever faithful to the Constitution and Union. That was Louisiana. Alabama, a union of equality as adjusted by our Constitution. Georgia's stone, the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is. From northern states, a different sentiment. Delaware's read, "First to adopt will be the last to desert the Constitution." Illinois' read, "State sovereignty, national unity." And Missouri's read, "The tribute of Missouri to the memory of Washington and the pledge of her fidelity to the Union of the States." So what these inscriptions are pointing to in 1850 is the heightened tensions surrounding the Compromise of 1850 and the way in which the South uses Constitution as a code for the protection of slavery. And that becomes the rhetorical posture of the South through the 1850s, in the way that Union becomes the mantra of the northern states. And indeed, when the Civil War breaks out, the initial rhetoric around it is fighting for Union. At the time of the Civil War, the monument was far from finished. So Crawford's plan was for a monument, not an obelisk, but instead a monumental sculpture about 60 feet in height, surmounted by an equestrian of Washington, with 6 sculptures of other eminent Virginians at the base. These Virginians, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and John Marshall, were meant to represent oratory, statesmanship, and jurisprudence, or the legislative, executive, and judicial departments, and the other ones added later, George Mason, Thomas Nelson, and Andrew Lewis. And the totality of it was meant to be, as the newspaper said, the whole group beautifully represents Virginia and her sons doing honor to the great and good Washington. So rather than submitting a monument to Washington, the great national leader, Crawford designed a monument to Washington, the great Virginian. And that's what they liked about it. And what they really liked about it was that it was his military character that it captured. To the military, this is what was written in the newspaper, to the military spirit of George Washington, we are indebted for our liberties. And speaking more about the monument, the South, has now taken step in defense of her right to this honor, while political discussion is rapidly striding over our fair country under the influence of the sinister movements of our enemies, leaving here and there the seed of bitter fruit. What more powerful example of all the Christian virtues could be elevated before us, like image of the father of our country? And they specifically liked that it linked George Washington to Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman general. So when the sculpture was unveiled in 1858, Virginia planned the most elaborate day of ceremonies ever seen, a full day of processions and speeches and dinners and balls, all of which gave a unified meaning to Crawford's monument. Probably the most notable aspect of the planned ceremony was the large number of military companies that rushed into Virginia to Richmond for the occasion. And this presence added considerable weight to the image of the militaristic Washington, not the Republican giving up power, and gave visual form to the growing attitude of Virginia's political leaders in their pro-slavery political resolve. There were 24 volunteer militia companies from outside Richmond, another 10 from inside Richmond. The cadets of VMI were there, and they marched through the city for hours in parades on that day. In these events, the speeches made clear that the sectionalized political climate was being attached to this sculpture, and it helped cement its collective meaning. For example, a Virginia member of the House, M.R.H. Garnett, gave a speech which was described as a warm Southern speech, in which he, quote, denied the nationality of the claim to Washington's name and fame. He declared they were the property of Virginia, and that other states had no more claim to them than they had to the fame of Shakespeare and Milton. And he concluded with this provocative toast: the South last, and the South at all times. Now, Edward Everett was also a guest. He was one of America's most popular orators and authors. He was later the vice presidential candidate for the unsuccessful Constitutional Union Party and a very important of Mount Vernon. And for him, Washington was a powerful symbol of union. Everett sensed there was much at stake in these speeches, and when he rose to speak, he said, "I believe in monuments. I believe in them as works of art, but a patriotic monument is a far nobler work." Nobler, yes, but what he was really trying to talk about was its effectiveness, because he understood that monuments played important roles in shaping collective opinion. Now, his closing remarks, even though he thinks they're about union, they really capture the spirit. That rigid arm, Everett remarked, shall point the unerring road to the welfare of the country more surely than the arm of any living flesh. Any fiercer thunder than that of the elements shall clothe the neck of that monumental war horse and strike terror to the hearts of the enemies of the Constitution and the Union. So Everett got a lot of that right. He identified that monuments help shape opinion. He was also correct in how Virginians ultimately saw the monumental war horse as a symbolic representative of their own desire to strike terror in the enemies of the Constitution, but for the South, it was to those who would try to end slavery. As Senator James Mason declared for the assembled audience, "My countrymen, the union that we intend to preserve, if we are allowed to do so, is a union under the Constitution and no others." To Southerners, this defense of Constitution became not destroying the Union, but instead restoring it to what they perceived was an earlier glory. They were merely, they claimed, struggling to protect the legacy of the First Revolution. The Charleston Mercury, on their secession, declared, "The tea has been thrown overboard, the revolution of 1860 has been initiated." Thus it was that the militaristic Washington was claimed by the Confederate States of America as their rightful symbol. Secession became the Second American Revolution, and Jefferson Davis became the new George Washington. Given the rhetorical weight of Southern nationalism, it's not at all surprising that the Confederate States of America selected the equestrian sculpture at the top as the centerpiece for the seal of the Confederate States of America. It is also not surprising that this monument came to be the place where the performance of Southern nationalism was cemented. In February 1862, Jefferson Davis stood beneath the Virginia Washington Monument and delivered his second inaugural address as President of the Confederate States of America. He drew upon the intimate connection that he saw between the American Revolution, George Washington, and secession. He said, "On this, the birthday of the man most identified with the establishment of American independence, and beneath the monument erected to commemorate his heroic virtues, we have assembled to usher into existence the permanent government of the Confederate States of America. We hope to perpetuate the principles of our revolutionary fathers. The day, the memory, and the purpose seem fitly associated." Thus, in Richmond, separated by only about 100 feet, we have two sculptures of George Washington. One, George Washington as Cincinnatus, the man who resigned his military power in order to preserve republicanism, and he was the appropriate symbol for that moment in the late 1780s, a reminder of the principles of the Republic. But by 1858, it was Washington as Marcus Aurelius, as an imperial leader to defend Virginia's constitutional rights. He then became the appropriate symbol. And so here, in these two monuments, close to one another, we see two distinctly different remembrances of Washington, both of which perhaps tell us more about the men who chose them and the moment they were created than they really tell us about Washington himself. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
Was Jefferson that adept at French, or did he keep an interpreter with him when he was in Europe?
So the question is Jefferson that adept at French? Yes. Jefferson was, in fact, enormously adept at languages. He read 10 and spoke 7. French his best, but many other languages as well. So Jefferson was fully fluent in the court of King Louis XVI. And if you've ever seen the fairly horrific movie with Nick Nolte as Thomas Jefferson, where you get the sense of him bumbling through Paris, that's not at all correct. Nolte, a strange choice, I think, for Jefferson. Yes?
Madison is missing from the statue in Britain?
No Madison. because they were all supposed to be linked directly with the revolution. And so he was not on their list. And they took one guy out, I can't remember which it was, Andrew Lewis gets put on late because whomever they had chosen first, and sorry, it's not coming to my mind, they realized wasn't born in Virginia. He had been like born in New Jersey, but then moved to Virginia when he was 1. But that, nope, not that wasn't going to be okay. So, yes?
How was Washington's life mask made?
He was put on his back, and the plaster put over his face, and then didn't they put a straw through the mouth so that he could breathe during that period? And his nose. Okay, yeah. So it would have been unpleasant, but it didn't take that long thing to do.
You mentioned that the band bust of Jefferson. Jefferson was not wearing a wig. Did he ever wear a wig? Did George Washington ever wear a wig?
No, and I don't think Jefferson does either. But what's unique about that is everybody at court would have had on a wig, right? And Jefferson makes certain adaptations to being in court because he doesn't dress like the nobility does, but he also doesn't dress like a simple Republican either. I mean, he dolls it up a little bit when he's in France and then dolls it back down when he comes to the US. But he, very specifically, and Franklin did the same thing as well, they worked very hard to make it clear we are not European aristocracy. And they are all, that early generation is all part of shaping what it means to be a Republican leader. And the presentation of self was very important. And thanks to men like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, they didn't choose to go with European. Otherwise, our president would be His Excellency, and we'd have a variety of other trappings. In the back.
Well, of course, Marcus Aurelius was also an emperor
Yes.
and a philosopher, but those aspects of Marcus Aurelius probably were not mentioned. Or not.
Yeah, for them it's like, great classical leader on a horse, that's really cool, right? And part of that's because this is the only surviving bronze equestrian from the classical period. And the only reason it survived is because later generations believed it was Constantine, who's the emperor who first sort of legalizes Christianity, and so it survived a sort of pagan purge where many other sculptures were melted down. Yes?
Keeping in mind the statue in Old Town Alexandria of the Confederate soldier facing south, what way is Washington's statue facing? The equestrian?
South.
I was hoping for north.
Yes?
What went into deciding that the president would be referred to as Mr. President?
I should probably defer to somebody else who knows the history of how Mr. President came to be. Is there anyone, any of my experts near the front want to jump up and give that one? I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you for that one. Yes, sir?
Was the raised horse's leg indicate wound? I put that one leg up, the person wounded, 2 legs up, they were killed.
There are all kinds of little stories that emerge like that when you look across the history of sculpture, they don't always hold. Yeah. No, it's meant, the sculptor did it. It's really hard to get an animated horse, right? And they really wanted, in some instances, wanted an animated horse. So Crawford wanted an animated horse. When you get any of those of you who know the Lee Monument in Richmond, right, Traveler's just standing there, right, not animated at all. And that was a choice of that moment, and that they wanted, and they specifically wanted that. But then Jed Stewart, slightly farther down Monumental Avenue, has this great sort of, really exciting animated horse. So it usually has more to do with either the sculptor's vision or the patron's vision.
These horse, they finally face the north.
I don't think it's facing north. It's facing, Monument Avenue runs east-west. Yeah, so it faced the way it needed so that the real estate developers in Richmond who fight to get it on Monument Avenue where no one lives and there's nothing there, it was serving a bit of a real estate purpose. Yes? Yeah, sure.
Last night, the talk mentioned 1798 Charles Buxton Masonic imagery of it was the death of Washington, something like that. Sorry, I can't remember. But so I was wondering, looking at that, the column there, how the Roger or Robert Mills imagery, was that a huge, I'm just curious how the Washington Monument, just one large direct.
So I'm going to leave, we have a talk later today on the Baltimore Washington Monument, and perhaps we should leave that question till we've heard the talk and then see how we need to expand out from that. One more, you're the last one.
Is there a link between the statue of Washington, the Virginia Monument, and the statue of General Lee at Gettysburg? Because there's something, it's reminiscent.
Right, so I don't really know much about the Lee at Gettysburg and the date of its execution. All major sculptors know this, right? Because it's a really early equestrian bronze in the nation by this point, but this is, kind of when they start emerging. And they all know those works. So there is a certain, referencing to any and all monuments. So, the Lee in Richmond is very directly referencing this, right? So they tend to, they know the precedents and they're kind of answering and talking to those precedents. All right, well, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you so much, Maury. That was truly a phenomenal start to our day and gave us an awful lot to think about. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carol Cadieux, and I serve as Senior Vice President at Mount Vernon for Historic Preservation and Collections. It's my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker, a truly outstanding colleague, scholar, and professional, as well as terrific friend of Mount Vernon, Ellen Miles. Ellen Miles is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College. She received her master's degree from Yale University and was subsequently awarded her PhD from Yale, where her dissertation focused on English mid-18th century portrait artist Thomas Hudson. Dr. Miles began her career at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in 1971 as a research assistant, retiring 39 years later in 2010 after serving for 16 years as curator and chair of the Department of Painting and Sculpture. Today, she holds the distinguished position of Curator Emerita for the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the National Portrait Gallery. The list of Dr. Miles's exhibitions and lectures is nearly as long as the impressive list of her publications. She has curated exhibitions on artists Thomas Hudson, John Singleton Copley, St. Memon, and Gilbert Stuart, as well as on the subjects of American colonial portraiture and George and Martha Washington. Her many publications include American Colonial Portraits, 1700 to 1799, St. Memon and the Neoclassical Profile Portrait in America, George and Martha Washington, Portraits from the Presidential Years, the remarkable and stellar recent volume simply entitled Gilbert Stuart, and her most recent book, Capital Portraits, Treasures from Washington's Private Collections. Dr. Miles is the recipient of numerous awards. She's been named the Smithsonian's Distinguished Research Lecturer, and she served for 8 years on the editorial board of American Art. Ellen Miles is not only a distinguished American art scholar and professional, she is widely recognized as an expert on the portraits of George Washington. While this is certainly enough to endear her to Mount Vernon, it is her terrific collegiality and enthusiasm for all things George Washington that has made our collaboration so very special over the years. When we first hatched the idea of a new museum at Mount Vernon and the thought of recreating George Washington at various stages of his life through forensics, Ellen Miles enthusiastically jumped in to assist us in making certain that our galleries, as well as our representations of George Washington, were the best possible. Ellen continues to serve as a generous and enthusiastic colleague, freely sharing her insights and knowledge of Washington portraiture gained over nearly 4 decades of her terrific research. This morning's lecture focuses on artist Gilbert Stuart, who painted probably one of the best known images of George Washington. To provide us with insights on both Gilbert Stuart and George Washington, please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Ellen Miles.
My life flashed before me. And I wanted to say how wonderful this is for me, because I think so many of you know Washington in so many different ways, that it's really a nice time for all these exchanges to take place. And I also want to say that I almost feel like I'm speaking to George Washington. That's not because he didn't agree with me. In Gilbert Stuart's 55-year career as a portrait painter, George Washington was his most important sitter. He painted 3 portraits of Washington from life in 1795 and 1796, during Washington's second term of office as president. These portraits have been known since the 19th century by the names of their first owners. They are, one on the upper left, the Vaughan type, a bust-length portrait owned by Samuel Vaughan, a London merchant, who, by the way, was the man who gave the marble fireplace to Washington that's in the new room. You can see it there. The Athenaeum portrait, named for the Boston Athenaeum, which acquired the painting, and its pendant portrait of Martha Washington in 1831, 3 years after Stuart's death. And the Lansdowne portrait, to whom the life-size full-length portrait named for William Petty, Marquis of Lansdowne, to whom the portrait was sent as a gift by William Bingham of Pennsylvania. These portraits exemplify the 3 reasons that portraits of Washington were created: a result of requests by ambitious artists, as commissions for family and friends, and as gifts for a third party or for a public setting. Because these 3 portraits were instantly popular with Washington's close admirers, Stuart himself painted about 100 versions of these 3 portraits, and numerous artists also made copies. The most copied portrait is the Athenaeum portrait, particularly well known to us because of the image on the reverse of the on the $1 bill, which dates from 1918, and the lithograph commissioned in 1932 at the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth. Stuart and Washington left us with almost no written documentation about these now famous images, so we depend on their admirers, who have left us numerous comments about the portraits. So we'll begin with Washington. By the time Washington was portrayed by Stuart in 1795, he had been painted and sculpted or drawn from life by at least 20 different artists, and had become a very reluctant subject for portraits. His responses to earlier sittings for 3 different artists will reveal the challenges. It is notable that Washington himself was not the patron for most of his portraits. He was first painted in 1772 when he was 40. The portrait by Charles Willson Peale was commissioned by Martha Washington as a pendant portrait for her painting by John Wollaston. Washington was not an enthusiastic sitter, describing himself at the sitting as, quote, "in so grave, so sullen a mood, and now and then under the influence of Morpheus," that is, he fell asleep. During the American Revolution, he was depicted by several artists, most successfully by Charles Willson Peale in full-length portraits. After the war ended, the demand for his portraits increased. By 1785, when English artist Robert H. Pine painted his portrait, Washington had resigned himself to the demands of portrait painters, writing his now famous comment. And actually, this led to Hugh Honor's title for his book. The quote is, "In for a penny, in for a pound," is the old adage. I am so hackneyed to the touches of the painter's pencil that I am altogether at their beck, and sit like patience on a monument, while they are delineating the lines of my face. It is a proof among many others of what habit and custom can effect. At first, I was as impatient at the operation as a colt in the saddle. The next time, submitted very reluctantly, but with less flouncing. Now, no dray horse moves more readily to the thill, that's the shaft of the cart, than I do to the painter's chair. So by 1784, he said, all right, I'll sit. Washington's portrait was even in greater demand after he was inaugurated first president of the United States. In 1793, I don't know how many of you have ever seen this before. This is in Alexandria, in the Masonic Temple. Artist William Joseph Williams persuaded Virginia Governor Henry Lee to write a letter of introduction to Washington to arrange for sittings for a portrait. Washington sent Lee his apologies that he would not sit. He said, I am so heartily tired of the attendance which from one cause or another I have bestowed on these kind of people, these artists, that it is now more than 2 years since I resolved to sit no more to any of them, and have adhered to it except in instances where it has been requested by public bodies or for a particular purpose not of the painters, and could not without offense be refused. I have been led to make this resolution for another reason beside the irksomeness of sitting and the time I lose by it, which is that these productions have, in my estimation, been made use of as a sort of a tax upon individuals by being engraved, and that badly, and hawked or advertised for sale. So he was firm, but Williams was not defeated. Williams, a Mason, offered to make the portrait of Washington for the Masonic Lodge in Alexandria, if the lodge would request the portrait. Washington was past master of the lodge, and the request was, of course, successful. And we see here the portrait completed in 1794, which is really one of the most direct portraits we have of Washington. It includes smallpox scars on his face, for example. Now here you see, if it were up to Washington, these are only two of the only probably 3 portraits we would have of him. These were miniatures that he commissioned. The one on the left was painted for Martha Washington just after his inauguration, and the second one was a gift to his granddaughter Martha Parke Custis just before her marriage. Now let's turn to Stuart. The artist was born in Newport, Rhode Island, or near Newport, Rhode Island, in 1755. By 1775, when he left America for London, he was already a trained and experienced portrait painter. His family were loyalists, and on the eve of the American Revolution, they settled in Nova Scotia. In London, Stuart joined the studio of American painter Benjamin West. After 5 years working as West's assistant, he had acquired the additional training and experience to paint the life-size portrait you see here of 32-year-old Scottish barrister William Grant. This painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy, and is known today as The Skater. It received great praise when it was exhibited in London, and this enabled Stuart to go out on his own, develop his own portrait studio. In his portrait, Stuart carefully selected poses and settings that best describe the sitter's status, profession, and interests. And in an April 1787 review in the London newspaper The World, his work was praised for his ability to capture likeness and character. Quote, in the most arduous and valuable achievements of portrait painting, identity and duration, Stuart takes the lead of every competitor. Stuart dives deep into the mind and brings up with him a conspicuous thought, all as sensible to feeling and to sight as the most palpable projection of any feature of a face. In London, portraits, including the preference to brush in the sketch with dark paint directly on the canvas, as you see on the left. In his portrait of circus performer John Bell Ricketts, with the sketching on the left of the horse that would be included in the finished picture. The dark area that Stuart painted around Ricketts' head appears in all of his unfinished portraits. It enabled the artist, when painting the face, to select the appropriate tones for the highlights and shadows. And then when the painting is finished, the background covers up that sort of area, that dark area. Here, later on, Stuart playfully added some ears to that background shape to make it another horse, but he never finished the portrait. You can see that. Also in London, Stuart learned to favor fine English twill canvases with their rough surfaces and became accustomed to the canvas sizes that English portrait artists typically used. A diagram of these sizes was drawn in 1817 by New Englander Henry Pickering when he visited Stuart's studio in Boston. Stuart's works ranged from the full-length canvas, like the skater that we saw, which measured about 80 by 50 inches, to smaller waist-length or knee-length canvases that concentrated on the sitter's head and shoulders. And the prices were charged according to the size of the canvas. He also learned the English practice of charging half price at the first sitting and the balance to be paid when the portrait was finished. After 12 years in London, Stuart moved to Dublin in 1787, where he painted portraits with great success for 6 years, including this full length of John Foster, Speaker of the House of Commons in Dublin, who is seen in that actual setting. The portrait has many of the features, setting, pose, and imagery that are similar to compositional features of Stuart's later full-length portraits of George Washington. However, in Dublin, Stuart also incurred considerable debts, and these apparently became the motivation for returning to America in 1793. He was 38 years old, and he'd spent 18 years in England and Ireland. He had a very specific goal in mind, to paint a portrait of George Washington. He told Irish artist John Dowling Herbert his plans. "When I can net a sum sufficient to take me to America, I shall be off to my native soil. There I expect to make a fortune by Washington alone. I calculate upon making a plurality of his portraits, whole lengths. And if I should be so fortunate, I will repay my English and Irish creditors. To Ireland and England I shall bid adieu." When Stuart arrived in New York City, he was not well known. His closest admirers included Pennsylvania Senator William Bingham on the left, and his wife Anne Willing Bingham, who you'll see later, and John Jay, whose portrait he had painted in London in the 1780s, all three people in London. Stuart spent more than a year in New York, where he painted numerous portraits, among them this second portrait of John Jay, who by then was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He also obtained a letter from Jay to Washington, which was necessary for the personal introduction that enabled Stuart to go to Philadelphia to meet the president. And you remember by then, Washington had said no more sittings to artists. So in each case of these three portraits, somebody had to introduce Stuart to Washington to make that contact. So Stuart went to Philadelphia in 1794. Philadelphia at the time was the capital of the United States. He arranged the sittings and actually painted Washington the following September, 1795. On April 20th, 1795, before he painted the portrait, he drew up a list of gentlemen who were to have copies of the portrait of the President of the United States. And this document has recently resurfaced and is now in this wonderful library in the collection of the Harlan Crow Library, Texas. It's been known since the 1880s from the quote from Jane Stewart's version of it, but we now actually have images of the actual letter, and so it's new. It's really exciting to have that. He drew up the list, and you'll see on this first page a number of people who he already knew from New York or England or Ireland, such as the Viscount Cremorne, the fourth person down, who was married to William Penn's granddaughter, lived in England. The Marquis of Lansdowne is on the list. Benjamin West is on the list. And John Vaughan and Colonel Burr, Aaron Burr is the last person on the list. These names on this list, and there are two more pages of the list, are clear evidence that Stuart had returned to America with specific commissions for a portrait of Washington. Next to the names are the number of portraits they commissioned, and in some cases whether they had already made a payment. Each bust-size portrait would cost $100. So at the bottom, John Vaughan and Aaron Burr and the Pollocks in New York had already paid some of the money. John Vaughan commissioned two, sending one to his father, Samuel Vaughan, in London, and that's the portrait that became known as the Vaughan portrait. Here are the two pages of the list, and you can see that the writing changes, and so he's adding names as he's in Philadelphia. He's adding the names of people. By the time it was completed, the list consisted of 32 patrons, and you can see that they're a good indication of Stuart's American patrons, including Jay, architect Samuel Blodgett, and General Henry Lee, and these people we'll mention again later in the lecture. By the time Stuart painted Washington, he was very experienced at painting portraits. His approach combined close observation with small talk and conversation in his studio to relax the sitter so that he or she would adopt a characteristic pose. Typically, Stuart's patrons would have had 3 to 5 sittings, about 2 hours each. One of Stuart's sitters, a young lawyer you see here, Horace Binney, left a long description of his sittings with Stuart. He is seen here in the portrait that Stuart painted of the sittings. Binney began by asking Stuart, "How do you wish me to sit? Must I be grave? Must I look at you?" And Stuart replied, "No, just as you are. Just do what you want. Look way up wherever you want. Walk around the room, talk, laugh, move around, if you please, whatever." And in fact, Binney sat for the portrait listening to Stuart's story. Stuart was famous for telling all sorts of jokes and stories. And at the end of an hour, he writes, "I rose to go, and looking at the portrait, I saw that the head was as perfectly done as it is at this moment, with the exception of the eyes, which were blank. I gave one more sitting of an hour, and in the course of it, Stuart said, 'Now, look at me one moment.' I did so. Stuart put in the eyes by a couple of touches of the brush, and the head was perfect. I gave no more sittings." The rest of the painting, the coat, the book, and the hand were completed without Binney at the studio. And this was pretty typical, that the face, the head is the life portrait, and the rest is created by the artist after the person has left the studio. Despite this experience, Stuart encountered difficulties in painting Washington the first time. The young artist William Dunlap later wrote about Stuart's difficulties. Stuart has said that he found more difficulty attempting to express the character of Washington on his canvas than in any of his efforts before or since. It is known that by his colloquial powers he could draw out the minds of a sitter upon the surface that he was tasked to represent, and such was always his aim. But Washington's mind was busied within. During the sitting for the first portrait, Stuart could not find a subject, although he tried many, that would elicit the expression he knew must accord with such features in such a man. Despite Stuart's dissatisfaction, the portrait was apparently successful, for Stuart completed about a dozen replicas, which is the term we use for copies by the original artist. The portrait that was sent to Samuel Vaughan in London in 1795 on the left was identified in 1859, so 5 years later, as Stuart's first portrait of Washington. And from it comes the name Vaughan for this type of portrait series, painting to the right, facing right. After researching this group of portraits, I've concluded that, in fact, the life portrait may have looked more like the example on the right, owned by the Frick collection. The evidence is in 2 sources. First, Stuart signed a statement in 1823 that he had, quote, rubbed out the first life portrait, and that no longer survived. And I'll show you this written comment later. Second, 2 of the replicas, including the Frick collection example, have an unusual color scheme for the portraits of Washington. They depict Washington in a brown coat in front of a green curtain. Choice of dress was one of the many protocol decisions that Washington made as the first American president. The brown coat has been described by his contemporaries as the color that he wore on casual occasions or informal occasions. The black coat, black velvet coat, was part of the more formal suit he wore when he appeared in public as president. So I would suggest that the first versions show him in the brown coat, probably because that's what he wore at the actual sittings, and that Stuart changed the color of the coat on realizing that the formal portraits of Washington needed to depict him as president in his black coat. The success of this portrait led to a commission from Martha Washington. So again, Martha was able, of course, to convince George to sit. She wanted a pair of portraits of George and Martha, Vernon, when finished. The portraits are on larger canvases than the Vaughan portraits, and Martha Washington expected Stuart to complete them before Washington's retirement in 1797. When completed, the 2 portraits probably would have been posed seated, facing each other, which was fairly typical of portraits of husbands and wives in the 18th century. We can see that in this pair of portraits of John and Abigail Adams. But these were not, in fact, completed. And when you look at them, you can see that he's only completed the head, and then the dark area around the head And in the portrait of Washington, I think he's completed the background, probably leaving that tall white space for a column that he would have painted later on when he completed the picture. And you can also see a slight change in the coloration, but what you're seeing is the primed canvas, and in the case of the part nearest the frame, it's been covered up by a frame, so it hasn't. The frames that were put on them when they went to the Athenaeum in 1831 have oval center areas that protect the corners, or that reveal only the center part of the portrait. So the remaining part of the canvas is completely unpainted. We do not know how many sittings took place for the portraits. Jane Stewart, artist's daughter, was not an eyewitness to the sittings, but has written about them many years later and probably learned this information from her father. She wrote, "About the time that the Washingtons were sitting for their portraits, my father's painting room was the resort of many of the most distinguished and interesting persons of the day." She wrote that among those who accompanied the president to his sittings were General Henry Knox, and General Henry Lee. And she quoted Eliza Parke Custis Law, Washington's granddaughter. "I was present during many of the sittings and have seen the likeness of the dear general grow under your father's paintbrush." We have also some idea of Stewart's difficulties in getting Washington to respond. According to a visitor to Stewart's studio in 1827, so now Stewart painted Washington in Philadelphia. Washington retired to Mount Vernon and then died in 1799, we all know. Stewart moved to Washington only in 1803 for 2 years, to 1805, and then moved to Boston, where he spent the rest of his career. And a visitor to his studio in Boston learned the story a little bit. He would tell everyone, I think, about these portraits. In his painting room, there's an original painting he did of Washington, merely a head, the figure and drapery left unfinished. He amused us exceedingly by the account he gave us of the embarrassment at first as to how he was to get on with it. He found it such hard work to make General Washington speak on light subjects. However, he resolved to try at all hazards to make him laugh, and accordingly told him the old Joe Miller story of King James II's journey to gain popularity. This stupid story had the desired effect, and from that time, said Mr. Stewart, I had him on a pivot and could manage him nicely. And you remember Hugh Honor talked about the pivot, the sitter's chair, so you can imagine this image, this metaphor of Stewart talking about he was able to tell Washington how to turn and how to sit. I wish we knew the old Joe Miller story of King James VI. We don't. If anyone has any idea what it was about, just let me know. Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, wrote that during the sittings, the president was awakened when the painter began to talk about horses, a favorite subject of Washington. Other stories about the sittings include one about Washington's notorious temper, which became a measure of Stewart's ability to read character in his sitter's expressions. Stewart, according to his daughter, remarked to General Henry Lee that Washington, quote, had a tremendous temper, but held it under wonderful control. General Lee breakfasted with the president and Mrs. Washington a few days afterwards. I saw your portrait the other day, he said, a capital likeness. But Stewart says you have a tremendous temper. Upon my word, said Mrs. Washington, coloring, Mr. Stewart takes a great deal upon himself to make such a remark. But stay, my dear lady, said General Lee. Stewart added that the president had it under wonderful control. With something like a smile, General Washington remarked, he is right. Stewart believed that he had succeeded in representing Washington more successfully in the second portrait than he had in the first. To him, the character of the president was better represented. However, there's an important difference from the earlier portrait. Stewart later said about the Athenaeum portrait, when I painted Washington, he had just had a set of false teeth inserted, which accounts for the constrained expression so noticeable about the mouth and lower part of the face. Comparing it to Jean-Antoine Houdon's bust of 1795, which we've just seen, Stewart noted that Houdon's bust does not suffer from this defect. I wanted him as he looked at that time. And the distortion resulted from a new set of false teeth made by James Gardet, a Philadelphia dentist. Washington, as far as I know, referred only once to Stewart in any written documents. Well, twice, actually, there's a letter, but in his own diaries about appointments. Stewart had moved his studio to Germantown in summer of 1796 because he was bothered by the many visitors to his studio on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. On January 7, 1797, Washington noted in his diary that he, quote, rode to Germantown with Mrs. Washington to see Mr. Stewart's paintings. Perhaps it was on this visit that Stewart asked Washington's permission to keep the unfinished portrait in order to fulfill the commissions he received for replicas, which would provide a steady income. And as I mentioned, according to American artist John Nagel, quote, Mrs. Washington called often to see the general's portrait and was desirous to possess the painting. One day she called with her husband and begged to know when she might have it. The general himself never pressed it, but on this occasion, as he and his lady were about to retire, he returned to Mr. Stewart and said he saw plainly of what advantage the picture was to the painter, who had been constantly employed in copying it. He therefore begged the artist to retain the painting at his pleasure. And Jane Stewart, the artist's daughter, later wrote a similar story, that when General and Mrs. Washington took their last sittings, my father told Washington it would be of great importance to retain the originals, to which Washington was said to have replied, certainly, Mr. Stewart, if they are of any consequence to you, I shall be perfectly satisfied with copies from your hand, as it will be impossible for me to sit again at present. So the practical stand, I think, so interesting insight that Washington, it was a practical question. He couldn't sit anymore. He used the, Stewart had had enough sittings. From this time on, Stewart kept the unfinished portrait of Washington and that of Martha Washington, and he copied the president's portrait many times in the smaller format. By keeping the original life portrait, Stewart was following the practice of contemporary any type of official portrait for which they knew they would be commissioned to paint replicas, such as portraits of royalty. So Stewart was very much following the pattern of the European artists that he knew and wanting to keep the original that shows his response to Washington. Now we turn to the third life portrait, the Lansdowne full-length. The painting was a gift to William Petty, the Marquis of Lansdowne, from William Bingham, a wealthy Philadelphia merchant and the senator from Pennsylvania. Bingham sent the portrait to London in the fall of When William Petty was Earl of Shelburne, he had been English Prime Minister, who began the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War. Bingham, a merchant, was living in London at the time and was very eager for the war to end and trade to begin again. He returned to America but remained in contact with William Petty, who soon became the Marquis of Lansdowne. When tensions flared again between Britain and America in the early 1790s, Washington sent John Jay to London to negotiate a new treaty, now known as the Jay Treaty, which was signed in 1794. The Marquis of Lansdowne again was instrumental in resolving issues related to the new peace agreement. And the English newspapers gave an important clue to the meaning of the portrait when it arrived in London. Quote, the dress, the clothing Washington wears is plain black velvet. He has his sword upon the hilt of which one hand rests while the other is extended, as the figure is standing addressing the whole of assembly. The point of time is that when he recommended inviolable union between America and Great Britain. This statement to me clearly refers to Washington's support for the Jay Treaty, which he supported in Congress in the speech on December 1795. There are references to the recently signed treaty in Washington's actual pose with his outstretched arm, and the paper and inkwell on the table. The portrait is in the format of a full-length portrait, which following British custom was the most expensive form of portrait. It cost Bingham $1,000, 10 times the price of a typical head and shoulders. For the portrait, Stewart repeated the face from the Athenaeum, changing the direction of the eyes so that Washington looks off to our left. The imagery in the painting celebrates Washington's role as leader of the United States during the Revolution and during the Constitutional Convention, and as president. The black velvet suit, as I mentioned, refers to his role as president. The neoclassical furniture is fictional. It did not exist. Its decorative elements are derived from the Great Seal of the United States, which was authorized by Congress in 1782. For example, the oval medallion on the back of the armchair is draped with laurel, a symbol of victory, and its shield is similar to the one borne by the eagle on the Great Seal. And then there's a blue horizontal, a shield with blue and white stripes, red and white stripes, and a blue field, with the stars, 13 original stars, 13 states. The two eagles at the top of the table leg are in upright positions holding bundles of arrows, also seen on the shield. It's interesting, I don't know why, both arrows and not the laurel in one talon. Under the table are large books titled General Orders, American Revolution and Constitution and Laws of the United States, and these refer to past events, Washington's role as commander of the American Army and president of the Constitutional Convention. The books on the table are titled Federalist and Journal of Congress. The Federalist Papers, written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, discuss details of the new American Constitution, while the Journal of Congress recounts the everyday actions and votes in Congress. Also on the table are two papers and a silver inkwell with a quill pen, and the inkwell, which is fictional also, is in the shape of an ark resting on figures of recumbent dogs, and on it are the Washington family coats of arms, although apparently the silver inkwell never existed, as far as we know. The coats of arms have been put on it to show that it should have existed. And then on the table is a black hat. People wonder in the background what that is. It's a black hat with a black cockade, which is a Federalist Party symbol. Even the stormy sky and the rainbow are symbolic, as explained in a newspaper advertisement for the exhibition of a different version of the full length in New York. Washington was then described in the portrait as, quote, surrounded by allegorical emblems of his public life in the service to his country, which are highly illustrative of the great and tremendous storms which have frequently prevailed. These storms have abated, and the appearance of the rainbow is introduced in the background as a sign. Stuart was assisted in designing the composition by architect Samuel Blodgett, whose role was described years later by his nephew, William Smith. I wish to call attention to the adjuncts of the full-length portrait of Washington. I believe that the books, papers, drapery, table, chair, etc. in this picture were designed and sketched by Samuel Blodgett. Now here's this letter I mentioned earlier. On April 11, 1796, Washington wrote to Stuart in order to make arrangements for a sitting for his portrait. As with earlier portraits, persuading Washington to sit for a portrait required the skills of a close friend. In this case, William Bingham's wife, Anne William Bingham, whose portrait was painted by Stuart the following year. Washington mentions her in the letter. I think you can read his handwriting is very clear. Sir, I am under promise to Mrs. Bingham to sit for you tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and wishing to know if it be convenient to you that I should do so, and whether it should be at your own house, as she talked of the State House, I send this note to you to ask information. Of course, the State House is what we now call Independence Hall, and Stuart was in a house just on the next corner of Chestnut Street, so right nearby. An inscription added, I thought it was a pointer, but it wasn't. An inscription added in 1823 at the bottom is signed by Stuart and documents the history of his 3 life portraits of Washington. In this note, Stuart refers to Samuel Williams, the Boston merchant who lived in London and had purchased the Lansdowne portrait after the death of the Marquis of Lansdowne. And it reads, in looking over my papers to find one that had the signature of George Washington, I found this one asking me when he should sit for his portrait, which is the portrait now owned by Samuel Williams of London. So I thought it proper that it should be his, especially as he owns the only original painting I ever made of Washington, except the one I own myself, which was the Athenaeum portrait. I painted a third, but rubbed it out. So that I've taken as the literal evidence that he rubbed out that first one because he liked the Athenaeum one better than the first one. Stuart painted 3 well-documented versions of the Lansdowne. The original sent to London, the second version commissioned by Bingham and bequeathed by him to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and the third painted for New York merchant William Constable, which is now owned by the Brooklyn Museum. All of these people, the owners were the Americans were Federalists and very much in favor of the Jay Treaty. So there's a political allegiance there, political association that's behind these commissions. A 4th portrait was shipped in December 1797 from Stuart's studio in Philadelphia to Gardner Baker, manager of the Tammany Society's museum in New York. Baker exhibited it in the museum in February 1797. This fourth portrait was purchased by the federal government soon after Washington's death in 1799, and is believed by many of us to be the portrait that is now at the White House, where it has been since 1800. This portrait on the right is the one that Dolly Madison rescued from the advancing British Army in August 1814. Stuart often denied painting it. For example, Anna Maria Thornton, William Thornton's wife, wrote in 1802 to Dolly Madison that, quote, Stuart denies most pointedly having painted the picture in the President's house, and says he told General Lee that he did not paint it, but he had bargained for it. And I think this means the only way that that fourth permission and knowledge, because that was the only version available in Philadelphia. So I think it was painted in Stuart's studio, but that by that time, to complete these large paintings, he was hiring younger artists as assistants, and I think that's probably what he's referring to here. Thus, by 1800, the Lansdowne portrait, with its oratorical pose, had in effect become the president. After the president's death, however, Stuart redesigned the image with a change that removes the oratorical pose. And there are 4 examples of the revised version, including one that was owned by the New York Public Library for many years. It's now on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Stuart hoped to sell painting versions, life-size portraits of this portrait, to each of the capitals of the United States. But he only succeeded with Rhode Island, which ordered 2, and Connecticut, which ordered 1. However, it was the Athenaeum portrait that Stuart reproduced most often. During the next 30 years, Stuart painted over 75 copies of the original, which he had still in his studio. Stuart called the portraits of Washington his $100 bills, the price he charged for each copy that he painted. In contrast to this large number of copies of the portrait of Washington, Stuart made no copies of the portrait of Martha Washington. The replicas are abbreviations of the original, and over time, the manner in which he painted them became less precise because they were more quickly painted, and he was very familiar with the original. And in a curious way, I almost feel like they came over time to be a sort of self-portrait, because he knew that face as well as he knew his own face. The earliest versions, painted in Philadelphia between 1796 and 1803, Stuart's years in that city, show the greatest amount of detail, especially in the clothing. The example on the left was first owned by Charles Baring, a member of the London firm that founded Baring Bank. The detailed lacy shirt frill is very elaborate, and his hair is tied back with a large ribbon with an ornate edging to it, sculptor edging. By contrast, the versions painted in Boston at the end of his long career are more abbreviated and quickly painted. This can be seen in the portrait painted in about 1820 for Jonathan Mason, United States Senator from Massachusetts. Almost immediately, other artists began to make copies of the Stuart's originals. Many were commissioned copies, like the example on the right, painted by Philadelphia painter Bass Otis in 1815 for the Mutual Assurance Company, not anywhere near as good as Stuart. One early copyist was Chinese. A merchant named John Sword purchased one of Stuart's paintings of Washington and took it to Canton, China, where a Chinese artist made at least a dozen copies, including the one on the left. And these are what you know the term on the inside of the glass. When he returned to Philadelphia and offered the copies for sale, Stuart sued him, and in 1802 he was ordered by the district court to cease and desist selling the copies. Another copyist was Stuart's daughter Jane, who faithfully recorded the unfinished area of the original in her copy. So, what is the importance of Stuart's portraits of Washington? First, they are among the last to be painted of Washington at life sittings. Second, they show Washington as president, not as general. Third, the Lansdowne sums up his great contributions to the American nation, as described by the New York newspaper in 1798 in, quote, allegorical emblems of his public life in the service of his country. Fourth, in a curious way, I think they benefit from Stuart's skills and talents and his emotional distance, unlike John Trumbull and Charles Wilson Peale, who had served with Washington during the American Revolution and painted Washington as a military hero. Stuart painted Washington the civilian statesman. And what do they tell us about portrait painting in late 18th century America? As we've seen with portraits of Washington this time, portraits of Washington were commissioned for particular purposes: to celebrate the new American Republic and its leaders, to identify political ties and allegiances, and to record family relationships. The artists who painted these portraits were more numerous, more sophisticated, and better trained than earlier colonial artists. Among them were Europeans as well as Americans, and they filled the demand with their sophisticated working knowledge of European portraiture. This in turn encouraged a new younger generation of artists in America, and many of these younger artists turned to Stuart for training and ideas about composition. So for a man who died poor, in fact broke, Stuart left us a major legacy. Thank you. So some of the questions that have been asked may have been answered, or they may have not been answered. So any questions? Yes?
On the list of commissions, or did this
No.
travel among a social circle?
About this, because we've studied this. It's very much a small group around him. And I think that's important to remember, that the people who, it's not like he tacked it up somewhere and said, I'll paint you for $100, I'll paint you a copy. These are all, I think if we studied all the owners, the original owners, we would see that all of these portraits begin with someone with a personal contact with Stuart. The frustrating thing with Stuart is that we have so little documentation, which is why this list now surfacing is so exciting. Now, only 4 people in that list are known owned a portrait of Washington, so we really don't even know whether he in fact managed to fulfill that list of commissions. But it was definitely a small group, a close-knit group of people who supported Stuart, knew Stuart from England, and then people who had a Federalist as the unifier, sort of not the political division that would develop between Adams and Jefferson supporters.
So when they had that quantity
Mhm.
to have to do, did he have assistants that would do the bare bones, and then he would come in and do the fine?
Well, he did, this is 75 over 30 years. So, his daughter describes him seeing 2 or 3 on easels at the same time. So to a certain degree, he could begin one, do what they called the dead coloring, which is the very basic laying out of the composition. By 1796, he already had a young artist, John Vanderlyn, working in his studio. We know that because Vanderlyn wrote about, he was a protege of Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr arranged it. And then he wrote that he was getting permission to copy the portrait, so we know that he said, Stuart is having me do the dead coloring, the background painting. There's some hint that he used a mechanical way of tracing the copy to get something similar. But what's so fascinating about them is that each one is different. Each one is slightly different. They're very freshly painted. They're not mechanically done at all. So that's why I kind of regard them almost as a self-portrait later on. Yes?
Did he sort of find this reproduction and just sort of doing the same thing over and over satisfying at all? Do you have any insight as to if he felt this was a good way to spend his life? I mean, it seems like artists...
Oh, well, he was so he was so busy with all those other people who came. Well, we saw the painting from the 19th century of Stuart painting Washington, and you saw the other people in the studio. We hear stories about from Jane Stuart that other people came. All those people were painted. Mrs. Bingham was painted. Her 4 sisters were painted. William Bingham was painted. Everyone in that circle was painted in their portraits. And then as he moved to different places, Senator Mason was the one who in Washington convinced him to move to Boston. So he commissioned a series of family portraits of his family. So Stuart had commissions, and I think that the copies of Washington were to satisfy, probably the two go together. We'll probably find that the people who owned the original portraits that he did, the replicas of Washington, also probably had their portraits painted. So the two things work together. It's not a mechanical process. Also, Stuart's a fascinating artist, and he had 12 children, and he always, when he sued that merchant, the Chinese merchant, it was because he was counting on the copies and the control of the copies to make money to support his family. Also, that's why he was so angry when he found out that the Lansdowne portrait had been engraved in England because he wanted to control the making of the engravings so that he could also sell the engravings. So for him, it's very much, he needs the income, but it's not, I think it's wrong to give it the tilt of an automatic kind of stamping out. You know, I think it's much more a group of people who admired Washington, who realized that Stuart had achieved this wonderful image and liked Stuart's work. So it comes down to, yeah.
When did Boston acquire
The Athenaeum? Stuart died in 1828, and his family was totally broke. He had no money, he had no will. And so they did a special exhibition of his work to attract attention. And then his daughter Jane sold the Athenaeum portraits, the portraits to the Athenaeum in 1831. So they've been in Boston.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then 1981, it was very interesting because I was already at the portrait gallery. Marvin Sadek decided somehow that maybe he could persuade the Athenaeum to sell the portraits to the portrait gallery. And the senator from Massachusetts at the time, I can't remember which one, decided, no, they are Massachusetts portraits. They belong in Massachusetts. And what was worked out eventually was that they were jointly owned. So they spend 3 years with the portrait gallery, and then they go to Boston for 3 years and come back. So if you see them up there, and then you come to the portrait gallery 3 years later, if you're puzzled, that's what's going on.
This Boston Athenaeum that has most of its library.
Yes, yes, that's right. From I think later on, from that, you would know better the story of the library, but it was from the Coolidges, wasn't it? Or is that right? 1840s, yeah.
I think there were also a set of medals in gold, I think
you're right.
that
Yeah.
Boston has.
Yeah.
So they,
The tracking all the things that Washington had is really interesting. One more question? Let's go right here. Yeah.
Did he ever do in America anything as dynamic as the skater?
No, that I can think of. In fact, he did very few full lengths. I think life-size full length, only the Washington portraits. The portrait of Bingham is not a large 80 by 60 portrait. It's a 50 by 40 with a full-length figure on it. He did several of those. Okay, thank you all. I'll answer questions. Thank you.
All right, we're running just a little bit behind, but we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back in here at 25 after. All right, thank you.
All right, 10 minutes. What? Go ahead.
After you.
Very well. All those.
Where are you folks from?
And is in Fredericksburg, outside. In fact, this whole village is on the wall. Open here, Greensboro, or you have fun. The rest of it's got about.
My girlfriend did something good. Take a walk to this. Good walk.
Outside is right.
Oh, hey, how are you? This is Lance from Canada.
I think they were just went through all the construction and the name was.
Commissioner Paul.
Well, so we, as there's a white color bed and breakfast, so we wanted to see what the park. Because we already had a house here. How you doing? Where do you live? Over West Charlotte. Yeah, right in the bottom.
Where? What's your name? Because I'm in the camp road. One of our members said Brad actually come to the and there's place called Brown and his family owns 5,000 acres.
So he must know that he would know process.
You know,
That's the tax. So CRO.
Of course, yes.
Oh, that's right.
Boy, they spin around different. It's like Madrid and
Well, exactly. Yeah, so he will know process. Brown Howard is right here.
I'm gonna tell him that.
So he'll know.
Oh,
Real close. No, the other one who was actually he wasn't good at the jail for the white staff.
sure.
There was a man here, it's kind of like
Right. Oh, really? Oh, I'm going to go to a friend of mine from Boston. And different home bills. I was talking to Seb Brown, and he was telling me that choose his actions from downtown. I didn't know that. They said they brought it up.
I didn't know where it was from. I knew they moved it.
Because, you know, I work in the community. They make sense.
Oh, it moved in here was Brown Hollow area. That's where it was. Oh, right in the basement. Go up and but
Is that made of sand?
it's an area.
It's an area. Oh, okay.
It sounds like on the hook for a while. Do your duty, right? You don't want to
They really reflected nothing we wanted.
Yeah, totally. And all of the like. Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh. That was
They didn't know if they were going to have I didn't realize you were.
He was reading. She might be listening now.
Oh, you're waiting for me? Oh, okay. We're waiting for me. I'm glad that.
That's exactly right. I'm wearing a sweater.
Get a line.
Well, I'm sure you all hear the school bell tolling. We should take our seats and get moving. So much more to learn. For those of you who may not have been here yesterday, I'd like to introduce myself as Barbara Lucas, the Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and I welcome you on behalf of all of the ladies, including our Vice Regent from Connecticut, Claire Edwards, who's here. These symposia are some of our favorites. I was thinking about all of the things that we've seen here and the talks we've learned about those things that of Washington, belonging to Washington, we really are theirs. So what's the next best way to see them all? And book lectures and other kinds of programs that we are now able to do, particularly under the auspices of the library. So I envy all of you who live nearby and can come and listen to these kinds of things all the time and get a chance to hear the brilliant lecturers and the amount of talent that we can present is just unbelievable. So we're very proud to do that, and I'm glad to see a full house. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Amanda Isaac, who is a graduate of the College of William and Mary, where she studied art and American University of Delaware's Winterthur program in early American culture. In 2008, Amanda worked as an appraisal associate for fine and decorative arts at Art Directives, Inc. out of Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, appropriately located, where she gained extensive experience in fine and decorative art analysis and evaluation. In her early days as a curatorial research associate, cataloged the crucial to our educational mission of making our collections accessible for students, enthusiasts, and experts in the field. In her current role as Associate Curator, Amanda researches, curates, and interprets a superb collection that ranges from George and Martha Washington's personal effects to the historical relics and commemorative objects that honor their legacy. Her primary research interests are American needlework, ceramics, and painting. Amanda's recent publications include Anne Flower's Sketchbook, Drawing, Needlework, and American and Women's Artistry in Colonial, featured in the Winterthur portfolio in 2006. Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 2013 in connection with an exhibit gave unprecedented insight into the diverse intellectual interests that shaped Washington's life as a military leader, farmer, statesman, entrepreneur, and a man of character and courage. Currently, Amanda spearheads the ongoing creation of a comprehensive mansion furnishing plan at Mount Vernon. She coordinates the research, writing, and editing of content of what Washington in the mansion. Her talk this morning, First in Art, George Washington as a Leading Patron of the Arts in America, will discuss Washington as a critical player in art patronage and his vision of promoting the rise of the arts in America, which he believed was crucial to the young nation's culture. Here in vivid detail, Washington assembled and how his distinctive vision elevated American subjects to the ranks of European masterworks. Please join me in
Thank you very much. And I also want to say a great thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Susan Scholler, Adam Irby, and Jesse McLeod in the curatorial department, who have given their insights into this talk as we've really been thinking about the big picture of the mansion and how the art functioned within that. Well, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, this is the Washington that we know very well. But arguably, Washington was also first in the arts of his countrymen. And it's that I'd like to talk about today, not just as a sitter and a subject, as we've been hearing about, but as a patron. He would later say, to promote literature in this rising empire. Too often, though, this aspect of his life, we allow that other Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, to be a multi-dimensional Renaissance man, a politician, a man of science, but he's also, we know him as an art collector. But Washington tends to be just a one-dimensional military and political leader. And our loss of understanding isn't just a matter of making him in our own image, as we talked about with some of the commissions that Maury mentioned, but it's really due to the fact that he came late to the business of collecting. He had a couple of other distractions along the way between the Revolution and the presidency. By 1797, though, he had assembled a collection, but only 2 years later, in 1799, he passes away. So there's not enough time for him really to finish installing or adding to it, or really even to show it for it to become well known among his peers. Jefferson, by contrast, after his initial acquisitions in Europe in the 1780s, has over 35 years to install, enlarge, reinstall, rethink, and then, more importantly, show his collection. It was on view for an extended length of time. It raises its visibility among his countrymen, influenced later collectors, and thus became integral to his historical profile. Washington's forgotten leadership also stems from the fact that American art historians and Deaf art scholars We've too often, too quickly dismissed 18th century America and its importance to the later development of the arts in the US. We lean heavily on John Adams' simplistic dictum, who says, "It's not indeed the fine arts which our country requires. The useful, the mechanic arts are those which we have occasion for in a young country." And we tend to shift the focus to the more prolific patrons and professional artists in the 19th century. So by and large, 18th century Americans are accused of having a self-serving taste for portraiture, a merely declining desire for more noble subjects. The problem with it, because generally it is, the problem is that it's all out in his study of landscape art. Was the coming of age for art. Full participants in the sea change as both artists and patrons. So if leading up to the revolution, England and the colonies were united in their cultural trajectory, afterward, Americans' new political identity raised the question of whether America also needed a new cultural identity. One gentleman even went so far as to suggest we should get a larger story.